Hi, my name is Noel Thames, and I'm going to be discussing the 2025 U.S. tariff implementation and its impact on the global economy and different market impacts that it had. So, a little bit of background information. So, these tariffs were called the Liberation Day tariffs, where on April 2nd, um, President Trump announced widespread tariffs on almost every country in the world that would be enacted, and that day, April 2nd, would be known as Liberation Day. President Trump decided to choose tariffs, believing that by implementing them, it would bring in foreign money that could help pay off the extensive U.S. debt, the $37 trillion debt that we can't afford because of our spending. And part of that controversy on these tariffs was because the other countries don't pay the tariffs. The tariffs end up falling on the consumer. So really, the money that's coming in is from things like price raises by companies that are dealing with tariffs, and it's not actually from other countries. So that's where people are saying that we shouldn't be dealing with these tariffs. We should be trying to build back up manufacturing in the United States, which was part of President Trump's reasoning, was to try to get these companies to bring back different manufacturing and make it in the U.S. instead of importing goods. So in the global stage, this can be seen either as liberalism or realism. So first we got to start off with like the definitions. So Slaughter in 2011 wrote that the goal of liberalism is to secure cooperation between democratic states through the creation of global institutions that can help run and keep control of this cooperation. Realism, on the other hand, is where states' main goal is to gain power and security in themselves, so they don't have to rely on other countries. They can rely on themselves. So this view of realism falls directly in line with what President Trump wanted. He wanted to bring back the power to the United States, not have to rely on other countries and what he believed they were taking advantage of us because they had their so-called tariffs. So he decided that he wanted to put these tariffs on these countries, and if they didn't agree with them, he just kept raising them and trying to use the United States authority in the global economy to bully his way into getting these other countries to drop their tariffs on the United States to try to make trade more fair, in his opinion. So that leads us into the international context. So the global supply chain was heavily affected by these tariffs. Kakowitz believes that globalization increases inequalities between the North and South because it also reduces poverty at the same time. What he meant by this was that globalization increases the power of the North and its influence. So the inequality, the difference between the power in the North and South grows as globalization increases. This reduces poverty in the North. However, in the South, it's the opposite question. President Trump's tariffs caused these southern countries, the more developing countries, to lose more power because they couldn't bargain for themselves in these negotiations with them. So this made them lose money because they just had to go along, and it affected people buying goods across the world, buying goods especially in the United States from China. That was a big one. It caused prices to increase out of fear and there to be less products on the market in general. This also caused market instability because, according to the BNP Paribas Economic Research, the tariffs created uncertainties in the global market, which especially affecting the developing countries, like I mentioned, because nobody knew what was going to happen. If they didn't agree with President Trump, then his tariff percentage was just going to increase and increase until he got what he wanted. So this effectively made a situation where you either have to agree with him or you try to call his bluff, as many countries did, where they just kept fighting and fighting, and eventually he just said, we're going to scrap that tariff because they called his bluff. So that kind of made, at the time when they were first announced, markets to heavily become unstable, and nobody knew what was going to happen. So this affected international trade. So tariffs were pretty much set up, according to Condoduca, Mancini, and Warren, to cause sharp changes in trade and create these major disruptions. So the changes that President Trump wanted was to bring manufacturing back to the United States so that we could increase our economic power and our GDP instead of having to import things from China or India or Thailand, countries that have fairly cheap labor that many U.S. companies have outsourced to so that they can create cheaper products and make more of a profit. So these tariffs, in turn, were used to make prices. Conert has a way of explaining it that in the EU, proposals for economic partnership agreements were helping with trade. They were helping trade between countries, but they were creating new barriers to reduce poverty. These barriers that he talks about are another way of saying tariffs, as tariffs make trade less efficient because companies either take the hit, they raise prices for consumers, all of these things that are not worth the fight. So as a result of tariffs, they pretty much raise prices on consumers because companies don't want to lose their profits. They want to increase their profits. So they're not going to pay a tariff when they can just raise the price to match the tariff on the consumers, because most consumers aren't going to just stop buying things. They're going to keep buying the product, and it's their way of controlling the market. Also, with these increase in revenue, President Trump wanted to lose welfare for many people, especially with his implementation of Doge at the start when these tariffs were announced, to cut the fat in the U.S. government. So this included things like SNAP, which with the government shutdown recently, we've seen many people lose benefits. Different healthcare and insurance, different green energy deal to want people to go to green energy and this clean energy to help the environment so we can live in a healthier world. He tried to cut these things with the implementation of tariffs to maximize the revenue for the United States. This leads into the implications with short-term and long-term effects. In the short term, the Peterson Institute for International Economics says that tariffs provide immediate revenue, allowing the government to give citizens things like stimulus checks or immediately help pay off debt. So this is true that tariffs, when they're applied, they immediately start bringing in money. However, it's not always as simple as it seems with that too. Especially in President Trump's case, where he tried to get investments in the United States as well as these tariffs, where if a country invested, it would lower the tariff or remove it completely. So this investment does not immediately give the money. However, many people in the administration include this in the amount that these tariffs are bringing in, which makes the revenue seem a lot higher than it actually is, which then allows them to say things like they're going to give citizens their stimulus checks, or give people money. Like, it makes it sound like we're bringing in so much money when we might actually not be bringing in that much. So in the long term, the Brookings Institution has experts that warn that tariffs actually increase inflation while also reducing welfare to citizens in the long term. So because these tariffs increase inflation, it also increases the debt as well, because the interest rates increase with inflation, which then increases our interest that we owe on our $37 trillion debt, which also ends up reducing the amount that the government has to spend on the citizens and give out benefits like SNAP or disability, or even benefits to veterans, things that as citizens we feel we need help with, that the government in turn, because they decide to implement these tariffs, may say, well, we can't afford it, and cut some of those things to pay off the debt on the effects that they caused. So President Trump is trying to take control of the United States power by bullying countries into investing in the United States, trying to bring companies back into manufacturing in the United States with threats of these tariffs that are going to make them either have to take a loss in profits or increase their price to consumers, which makes consumers not happy because they have to pay more money for stuff, while inflation is already extremely high, which makes it harder for the purchasing power of the people. Ultimately, tariffs may look good in the short term, that President Trump sees we can make revenue now, we can pay on these things now, but the damage it does in the long term ultimately is not effective in helping pay off debt, helping the power of the dollar, and having the United States citizens live in an extremely wealthy country. So thank you for listening to this. These are the citations and the sources that I used. Thank you.